Thank you for being here tonight on a Monday night for the 16th Ziadeh Lecture series in Arab and Islamic Studies. Today, April 8th, is in fact our dear Professor Ziadeh's birthday. He would have been 102 years old, but we lost him in 2016, unfortunately. And but I am so happy to have dear Ziadeh here with us tonight, with her daughter, their daughter Rima. Thank you for being here, Suad. It is always a pleasure to have your support with us for our department, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization. I am the chair of the department, Selim Kuru, and I am proud to host a lecture tonight with Professor Jane McAuliffe. I just want to tell you how important Farhad Ziadeh had been for this department when I started in 1999. He was an emeritus professor, but always on campus at his office on Wednesdays, meeting with students, faculty, anyone who would like to work with him. And he continued visiting the campus every Wednesday with his dear friend, colleague Nicholas Hare, Professor Nicholas Hare, Jerry Bucker, Walter Andrews, the founders of our program on this campus. Starting in 1968, Near Eastern Civilizations, Language and Civilization Department became a department in 1970, so next year it will be our 50th year, and this is thanks to Farhad's legacy and his traces of his enthusiasm that we carry forward. He was a leading scholar of Islamic law and Arabic grammar. He was a mentor, a great mentor to generations of students, and he had a big share in establishing Middle Eastern studies as a field in the United States after the 1960s. For example, he was one of the founders of the Middle Eastern Studies Association, which is our professional organization. So I just want to recognize him more. I hope our 50th anniversary celebrations will give you more information about his achievements. I want to thank for tonight to an organizational committee for this lecture, which was consisted of Professor Terry DeYoung, our Arabic literature professor, Arbella Bet Shilmon from History Department, and Hamza Zafer, who in fact organized this lecture with help from our one and only Patrick Gibbs, our administrator at the department. I am thankful to them. I would like to introduce you our Assistant Professor Hamza Zafer, who is going to introduce our guest to you. So there will be a lot of introductions initially, and then we will get to the topic. Hamza is a language wizard. His work is in Islamic studies and especially Quranic studies with a different stripe, I believe. He's currently working on two monographs, book projects. One is titled Quranic Communitarianism, the Ummah of the Proto-Muslims, and the second one is Matriarchs of Medina, Muhammad's mothers, wives, and daughters in early Muslim historiography. And he joined our department 6 years ago and developed various classes, very popular ones. His students love him. I haven't heard anything negative from them. And he taught about prophecy in the Middle East, such wide topics, and matriarchs became a class as he was working on his project. So he's always innovative and incorporates his research into his classes. This is some talent, trust me, I'm never able to do that. And also I mentioned his being a language whiz. One of our most popular classes ended up being Ge'ez, Old Ethiopic. I was expecting 5 students at most. There were 35 students in that class when Hamza taught it. I also commend his service and his work with immigrant populations in Seattle. So I would like to invite Hamza to introduce our guest.
Welcome everyone, good evening. I'd like to start by mirroring Salim's comments to thank the Ziadeh family for the Farhad Ziadeh Distinguished Lecture in Arabic and Islamic Studies series. This series has been a wonderful aspect of our curriculum here. It's my honor to introduce to everybody our lecturer this year, which is Jane McAuliffe. Jane McAuliffe is the Director of National and International Outreach at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. She has served in numerous institutions over her career, which includes serving as the president of Bryn Mawr, as well as the dean of Georgetown College and Georgetown University. She's also served as a professor and an associate dean at Emory University in Atlanta, and also the chair of religion and professor of Islamic studies at the University of Toronto in Canada. Additionally, outside of campus, she's also been the president of the American Academy of Religion, which is the largest largest association of its kind in America. Professor McAuliffe, outside of her academic work, has been a proponent of facilitating Christian-Muslim relations. It's been an aspect of her scholarship. She was even on the Vatican's Commission for Religious Relations with the Muslim community. I think it would be proper to say that Professor McAuliffe is one of the pioneers of Quranic studies in the Western Academy, especially in the North American Academy. The field of Quranic studies, as you would imagine, has transformed tremendously over the span of her career, and she's contributed to it immensely at every stage of its transformation, at every stage of its development. I would think that a big aspect of her legacy is the Encyclopedia of Qur'an that she was on the editorial team and she helped put together, which is a tremendous asset to people that work on the Qur'an in the Western Academy. Her works also include numerous other monographs. I just wanted to name a few. Just recently, the Norton Critical Edition of the Qur'an. And earlier, she worked on a book titled The Reverence for the Word, Medieval Scriptural Exegesis in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. She also has a book titled Quranic Christians, an analysis of classical and modern exegesis. And she produced an annotated translation of one of Tabari's volumes from the Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, titled The Abbasid Authority Affirmed, the Early Years of Al-Mansur. Now, Professor McAuliffe's work has deeply informed my own scholarship, my own training, so I'm really excited to be hosting her here at our university. Professor, thank you for accepting our invitation. We'd like to welcome you to our university and to our community. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jane McAuliffe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hamza. I have never been introduced as a pioneer woman. I love it, especially out here in this wonderful setting of Seattle. And I also echo my appreciation of being invited to give the Farhad Ziadeh Lecture and to be privileged to do so in front of Suad and her daughter Rima. I'm really very happy that such a turn of events could happen. I first met Farhad himself just 20 years ago. In the spring of 1998, the University of Washington hosted a conference entitled Integrating Islamic Studies into the Liberal Arts Curriculum. It was organized by a colleague who was then in the department, Brandon Wheeler, and included a number of scholars like Jack Bernard, Steve Wasserstrom, Juan Campo, and Richard Martin, who I believe is with us this evening. It eventuated in a volume, and it was my very first and a very positive contact with the University of Washington. Now, knowing that I was going to be speaking in a lecture series devoted or named in honor of Professor Ziadeh, I, of course, since I am at the Library of Congress, checked him out on the online catalog. Under Ziadeh, Farhad Jacob. And the Library of Congress, as you might expect, has his works on language and literature, the introduction to modern Arabic, the reader in modern classical Arabic that he did, in modern literary Arabic, has his works on law, both classical and modern. Al-Kashaf's Kitab al-Qadi. His work on the rule of law in Egypt, on property law in the Arabic world. But I was surprised to discover his publications on America. He wrote a book, along with a colleague, entitled Arabic-Speaking Americans, which I had not known about. It was written in 1946. Small work of about 29 pages, and I read it with great interest. It covers the contributions made by Arabic-speaking, chiefly Syrian Americans, and the book records everything from the efforts of late 19th century merchants to pre- and post-war contributions in journalism, literature, the arts, and scholarship. I have to note that this little book is not shelved in the library's general collection, which holds at this point about 170 million items. Rather, I had to go to the African and Middle East reading room to retrieve it. That reading room has a very carefully selected reference collection of only about 15,000 volumes. It, in fact, is currently being relocated within space at the Library of Congress that can only accommodate half that number of volumes. Nevertheless, Farhat's book, Arabic-Speaking Americans, will be one of those volumes in the new reference collection. Now, in that little book, in the section on scholars, I discovered some information about Farhat himself. At that time, he was a member of the Department of Oriental Languages and Literatures at Princeton. And during the war, this department had trained a large number of American soldiers in Arabic. And they were, of course, later stationed in various Arab countries. So Farhat and a colleague of his in that program produced a book in Arabic. They also were under the supervision of another famous scholar in doing this, Philip Hitty. And the English title of that book that they wrote in Arabic is A History of the People of the United States. Now, my talk this evening will be, I hope, a small contribution to the history of the people of the United States, and so I hope that Farhat will be pleased with his choice of topic. Let me begin 12 years ago in January 2007. On January 4th of that year, curators from the Library of Congress walked across the street to the U.S. Capitol building, accompanied by members of the U.S. Capitol Police. And they carried copies of the Bible, including some rare editions that had been requested by newly elected members of Congress for use in their private swearings-in. This procession of Library of Congress curators and U.S. Capitol Police occurs every 2 years, but in 2007 there was a difference. In addition to several Bibles, the curators carried a Qur'an. As I think many of you will remember, the first Muslim ever elected to Congress, Representative Keith Ellison, a Democrat from Minnesota, had asked to place his hand on the Qur'an while taking his oath of office. There we have him in 2007. He used Thomas Jefferson's copy of the Qur'an, which came to the Library of Congress in 1815 along with the rest of Jefferson's Bible. Of course, controversy erupted. One conservative columnist wrote, and I quote, "Insofar as a member of Congress taking an oath to serve America and uphold its values is concerned, America is interested in only one book, the Bible." And in fact, a Virginia congressman sent a letter to hundreds of voters warning them that Ellison's election was a threat to the nation's traditional values and could be a prelude to, and I quote, "many more Muslims elected to office and demanding the use of the Qur'an." A rather prophetic statement, actually. So let's fast forward 12 years to 2019. I'm going to put Jefferson's Qur'an up there as I do so. As you doubtless know, this year, 2 Muslim women were elected to Congress, Ilhan Omar from Minnesota and Rashida Tlaib from Michigan. And of course, they both used Qur'ans for their swearings in. These were not, however, I have to say, from the Library of Congress. I have not posted photos of them because, as you know, their faces have already been in the news quite a lot. And there was no significant controversy this time, although the House of Representatives did have to change a 181-year-old rule against wearing hats in the House chamber so that Representative Omar could be seated in hijab. Now, also in January of this year, on the 15th of January to be exact, the Library of Congress announced and posted online a major new acquisition. It was a collection of manuscripts that includes the only known narrative by an enslaved person in the United States. The only known narrative by an enslaved person that is written in Arabic. The author of this 15-page autobiography was a man named Omar ibn Said. In 1807, Ibn Said was captured in West Africa and transported to the United States as a slave. His autobiography is important as a personal story, but also because it documents part of the early history of Islam and of the Qur'an in the United States. Before speaking more about Ibn Said himself, let me start with some historical background. From the 16th to the 19th century, more than 12 million Africans were captured, transported across the Atlantic, and sold as slaves in the Caribbean, South America, and North America. This gives you a depiction of some of the slave trade routes. Scholars estimate that 15 to 30% of enslaved Africans came from the Muslim regions that are now Senegal, Mali, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia. Beginning in the 9th and 10th centuries, trading caravans from North Africa brought Muslim influence to West Africa. Conduits were merchants, religious teachers, and later Sufis. Urban centers and their ruling elites were the first points of interaction with Muslim belief and practice. Major mosques and centers of learning developed in Timbuktu, in Jenne, Agadir, and Kano. Here's a photo of the mosque in Jenne. Young children's education, of course, began then with Qur'an schools, and look, many would move on to more advanced study in Arabic, rhetoric, logic, law, etc. This from the Walters Art Gallery is a copy of what is known as the saddlebag Qur'an, one that was used by teachers as they moved from one city to another. As in other parts of the Muslim world, study stressed the memorization of texts, and this educational method will prove important as we trace the movement of Quranic learning to the Western Hemisphere. Most scholars agree that the Qur'an arrived in colonial America on slave ships. It arrived as an oral scripture held in the minds and memories of West African captives. It did not enter a welcoming environment. As you might expect, the continued practice of Islam in conditions of slavery was difficult and even dangerous. Families and people from the same region were torn apart on the auction block. There was no supportive culture of religious education and religious objects, nor any allowance for prayer practices, dietary prescriptions, or religious rituals. Eventually, enforced Christian instruction and Sunday observance, used as a means of subjugation and control, further marginalized Muslim belief and practice. So who was Omar ibn Said? He was born in 1770 in northern Senegal and died in 1864 in North Carolina. So his life spans the time between the American Revolutionary War and the Civil War. He began his education in Senegal and spent about 25 years as a student and scholar. His autobiography mentions 3 of his teachers, one of whom was his brother. Omar ibn Said was enslaved during a military conflict and transported to Charleston, South Carolina, around 1807. He was actually one of the last slave ships to legally enter U.S. waters. In January 1808, Congress outlawed the importation of slaves, although smuggling of slaves still continued. Ibn Said's initial owner in South Carolina treated him harshly, and he ran away from him about 2 years after his arrival. He was recaptured in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and jailed. Apparently he wrote some Arabic verses on the walls of his jail cell, and this attracted attention. And a man named James Owen, who was brother of one of the governors of North Carolina, secured Ibn Said as a house slave and apparently treated him well. In 1831, Owen asked him to write about his capture, his deportation, and his treatment at the hands of earlier owners. This is the autobiography that the Library of Congress has recently acquired and digitized. The manuscript begins with Surah Al-Mulk, the 67th surah of the Qur'an. It is written in Arabic, clear evidence of Ibn Said's education and former status as a scholar, and it began to be translated almost immediately. One of the earliest translations was done at the behest of an organization known as the American Colonization Society. This was an organization created to send freed slaves to Liberia, a colony on the west coast of Africa. It was supported by both abolitionists, largely Quakers and evangelicals, as well as by slaveholders. Slaveholders because they feared the disruptive potential of freed slaves who remained in America. But the American Colonization Society and its plans for Liberian migration were also opposed by many, including many freed slaves who wanted to remain in the United States. The American Colonization Society advocated for slave literacy even in Arabic, as a preparation for manumission and immigration. They assumed that most literate ex-slaves would be Christian, and it was assumed that they would spread Christianity in West Africa from this base in Liberia. But a slave literate in Arabic was particularly prized. Now, why would that be? Well, the American Colonization Society recognized that Islam had brought literacy, Arabic literacy, to West Africa, where language use formerly had been previously oral. So Africans who were literate in Arabic meant that there was a population who could receive translations of the Bible in Arabic and who could read the Bible in Arabic. So you could say that in many ways the Qur'an paved the way for the Bible in that part of the world. Now, a continually contested aspect of Ibn Said's story is the claim that he himself converted to Christianity. His conversion in the narratives that report this is dated to 1821, when his owner, this James Owen, gave him an Arabic Bible. Now, some scholars speak of this as a pseudo-conversion, and they can point to other instances in other parts of the slaveholding Americas, such as in Brazil, Jamaica, etc. At the very least, Omar ibn Said seems to have skillfully managed what we might call syncretism or hybridization, or what I would call multiple religious belonging. His last known Arabic manuscript was entitled The Lord's Prayer, but it's actually a paraphrase of the Fatiha, the opening surah of the Qur'an. This contestation over spiritual ownership of Omar ibn Said continues even in the contemporary scholarship on this figure, and it remains very much an open question. Ibn Said's legacy is still alive, remains very much alive today. Here's a photo of the mosque in Fayetteville, North Carolina, that is named after him, and in fact we had some of the leadership of this mosque at the Library of Congress earlier this spring. Now I'm going to say something about the acquisition of this collection by the Library of Congress. The Omar Ibn Said collection actually contains 42 documents in English and Arabic. This Arabic life of Omar Ibn Said is the centerpiece of the collection. The collection itself was assembled by an abolitionist named Theodore Dwight in the 1860s. And it represents, in that more than 100 years since then, an interesting story of loss and discovery. While, as I had said before, Ibn Said's autobiography was well known in the pre-Civil War period, interest in it waned after the war. And for a long time, it was thought to be in the possession of the American Numismatic Society. But then it went missing for decades and decades. In 1995, the collection was discovered, rediscovered, I suppose, in an old trunk in Alexandria, Virginia, not far from where I live in Washington, D.C., in a house that belonged to descendants of a former president of the American Numismatic Society. And so far as I know, nobody knows anything about that period of its loss or disappearance. It was then sold at auction in 1997 and purchased by a private collector, a man named Derek Beard. It was the price of the collection of all 42 documents was $20,000. Now, a word about Derek Beard, who died, unfortunately, just last summer. He was a collector of American and Islamic manuscripts and decorative arts, educated at the University of Illinois and the Art Institute of Chicago. And he would display this collection occasionally at museums, and he would let some scholars have access to it. In 2002, he spoke at a symposium at the Library of Congress on Islam in America. And at that time, he showed one of our Middle East librarians his collection of manuscripts and said that he hoped at some point the Library of Congress would be able to purchase it. So when he put that collection up for auction in 2017, he alerted the curators at the Library of Congress. He put it for auction with London Sotheby's, and the Library of Congress bought it in June 2017. I don't know how much they paid for it, and no one will tell me, so I don't have any info on that. Now, when the library acquires a collection of this significance, what does it do with it? And here I'm really going to go into my role as not a librarian. I would never pretend to be one. I do not have the training. But as somebody who has now worked for almost 5 years at the Library of Congress and loves this world that I have entered, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the curators and the conservators treat an acquisition of this sort. Let me start with, these are the tools of the conservators, and this is what they do when they get a manuscript that's as valuable as this kind of thing. First of all, they analyze the materials themselves, down to the kind of thread that is used in the bindings of the booklets or the rebindings that are done. They look at the ink. This manuscript is written in what is known as iron gall ink, which is made of iron salts and tannic acids. They use ultraviolet radiation to determine the degree of deterioration of the ink of the manuscript. In this case, in fact, they found that it was overall in good condition. And remember, it's quite an old document by this time. They then examine the paper. The document, the autobiography itself, is written on rag paper, which is a cotton and linen blend, with no watermark. So it did not require any chemical treatment for stabilization. But they had to find a very compatible paper in order to mend those parts of the document that had torn away during the many years that it has been in existence. Then they start looking at the binding, and what they do is what they call disbinding the manuscript. They discovered the cover had been put on about 2 years later, and that there was actually another layer of stitching through the fold beneath it. And this is where the thread analysis becomes relevant to them. The cover, the curators or the conservators really discovered, was also a different kind of paper, what one of them called paper bag quality paper. It was made with straw in it, and this had to be chemically treated in order to stabilize it. So this is what the manuscript looks like when it's unbound. And let me see, did I miss? No, okay. And this is the first page of it after treatment. So this is what a conservator, sorry, here I am. This is what a conservator had to do with that cover made of a much inferior paper in order to chemically stabilize it. They actually put it in a water and alcohol bath. And she did tell me that when they do this, they kind of hold their breath. You know, that nothing terrible is going to happen because it feels like such a big step to take a paper manuscript and immerse it in water of this sort. But this is how they then repair the cover after it's, and the first pages after it's been treated in that fashion. Another thing they do in a manuscript of this sort and this fragility is create a facsimile manuscript, because this manuscript is kind of the joint possession of the Rare Books Division of the Library of Congress as well as the African and Middle East Reading Room Division. And they want to be able to make it accessible to researchers, but they can't hand over the actual fragile paper copy of it. So they make an absolutely identical facsimile. I've seen them on a table next to each other, and frankly, I can't tell the difference between what is the original and what the facsimile is. They then take the original and they build a special casing for it to make sure that it is permanently protected against environmental changes in temperature, humidity, etc. at the library. And finally, they digitize it. This, again, because of the fragility of this manuscript, they brought the digitization equipment right into the conservation lab and did the digitization of the manuscript there. And that's what allows them to put a very high-quality digital image of every page of that manuscript on the public website of the Library of Congress, along with the other 41 parts of that collection. So I'll step back from this library world for a moment and talk a little bit about other areas in which one can search for and find evidence of the Qur'an in America. One of the first places would be to ask, well, were there other slave scholars like Omar ibn Said? And yes, there were. One of them is a man named Job ben Salman, Ayyub ibn Suleiman. He too came from Senegal, the easternmost part of that area. His native language was Wolof, but his father was a religious leader and scholar, so Job, of course, was also educated in Arabic and became a hafiz of the Qur'an, one who had memorized the entire Qur'an. Job was taken captive in 1731 on a trading mission to enemy territory, and he was put on a slave ship to Annapolis, Maryland. He was sold to a man who lives on Kent Island, Maryland, but he too later escaped, this time to southern Pennsylvania, where he was captured and imprisoned. Then something interesting happened to him. During this imprisonment, he met a British minister and judge who was temporarily residing in Annapolis, a man named Thomas Blewett. Blewett secured a Wolof translator because he wanted to hear Job's story. And then hearing about his rather elite background in West Africa, Blewett tried to get a letter back to Job bin Salomon's father, and eventually, especially through the intervention of James Oglethorpe, the first governor of the Georgia colony, he did manage to get a letter to Job's father. Oglethorpe then arranged for both Job bin Salomon and Thomas Blewett to travel to London. What they wanted Job to do, of course, was become an emissary for the British Trading Company in Africa, so that he could be a conduit for the exportation and importation of goods between London and those areas of Africa where the British Royal African Company was trading. Thomas Blewett taught Job English and eventually wrote his memoir, the first biography of a sub-Saharan African published in European language. According to this memoir, Job bin Salomon wrote out 3 copies of the Qur'an from memory. And this is from page 46 of Blewett's biography. I quote, "His memory, Job's memory, was extraordinary, for when he was 15 years old, he could say the whole Al-Qur'an, it was called, by heart. And while he was here in England, he wrote 3 copies of it, without the assistance of any other copy, and without so much as looking to one of those 3 when he wrote the others. He would often laugh at me when he heard me say that I forgot anything, and told me he hardly ever forgot anything in his life and wondered how anybody should." Well, as a senior citizen, I have things to say about that. But at any rate, in 2013, one of the Qur'ans that Job bin Salomon wrote from memory surfaced as lot number 137 at Bonhams, a London auction house. It was acquired by a private collector for just over $25,000. We don't know where it is at this point. There are several others to whom I could point who fall into this category of West African scholar slaves. Another is a man named Ibrahima Abdurrahman, who was enslaved in Mississippi, but eventually freed through the intercession of U.S. Secretary of State Henry Clay. He was returned to Africa, to Liberia, through the assistance of the American Colonization Society, but died shortly after his return. He had become popularized in the early 19th century as an African prince. And in fact, in 1977, a biography was written about him entitled Prince Among Slaves, from which a movie or documentary type movie was eventually produced. But let me expand this exploration now beyond this category upon which I've been focused to a few others, and I'll do this much more quickly as we move through. I'll talk about a few other categories in which we find such evidence of the Qur'an in America. One is, of course, our own statesman. John Adams, the second president of the United States. In the rare book room of the Boston Public Library, there's a book known as Adams 281.1. It's a copy of the Qur'an, a translation of the Qur'an, from the personal library of President John Adams. One, I think, with which you are even more familiar is the copy of the Qur'an owned by Thomas Jefferson, and I had put a picture of that up on the screen a few minutes ago. I dwell on this for a moment because it was, as many of you may know, Jefferson's personal library that became the core collection of the Library of Congress. In 1800, as part of an act of Congress that moved the national capital from Philadelphia to Washington, President Adams had approved spending $5,000 for books for the use of Congress. And that was the very first beginnings in 1800 of the Library of Congress. But you may remember that in 1814, the British came to Washington with torches. And they burned a lot of stuff, including that nascent library in the Capitol building that had been the beginnings of the Library of Congress. And this is the point at which Congress accepted Thomas Jefferson's offer to sell his comprehensive personal library of almost 6,500 volumes to begin again the Library of Congress. And it was really Jefferson's own collection, his universal collection. His library was not just law books or things that one might think would fit narrowly into the interests of Congress, but it was everything. It was history, it was philosophy, it was religion, it was art, it was this whole comprehensive sense, because he felt that, and the Congress came to believe, that there was no area of knowledge to which members of Congress should not have access. So that is the rationale for the now comprehensive collecting policy of the nation's library, the Library of Congress. And among the things that is now on permanent display at the library is Jefferson's copy of the Qur'an, which is the translation by George Sale. And those of you who know that translation know that George Sale prefaced his translation with something known as the Preliminary Discourse, which was a fairly lengthy treatise on Islamic belief and practice, which really served as the kind of primer of Islamic studies for a couple of centuries. And we can tell by looking at Jefferson's Qur'an, he puts a little TJ in the margins of things where he wants to make a notation or be reminded of an important point, that he in fact had read this, and they form part of his thinking about religious freedom, and first the work he did in Virginia and then for the nation. So statesmen are a category in which we can look for this evidence. Another category is scholars and ministers. And the first of these is a man named Ezra Stiles. Stiles graduated from Yale in 1746 and became minister of the Second Congregational Church in Newport, Rhode Island. He was eventually appointed president of Yale and served in that capacity until his death. He was also Yale's first professor of Semitics. Stiles kept a diary for most of his life, and from this diary we learn of his very intellectual interest. The diary expresses his own great pride in his linguistic accomplishments, and Hamza, listen to this. It encompassed Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Samaritan, Chaldee, Syriac, and Arabic. His interest in Arabic, Stiles' interest in Arabic, was stimulated by his studies in Hebrew Bible and his desire, as with a number of biblical scholars, to learn its cognate languages. And his diary also records the stages of his study of Arabic and notes his citation of passages from the Qur'an, all in the service of philological exegesis of the Bible. The first commencement address he gave at Yale, in his role also as professor of Semitics, was delivered in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. I have to give a commencement address a little later this spring, and I thought, wouldn't it be fun to stand up and speak Hebrew, Aramaic, and anyway. The next figure is William Bentley. He's a graduate of Harvard, and like Stiles, also a Congregationalist minister, this time in Salem, Massachusetts, although Bentley eventually became a Unitarian. He too was offered a university presidency, this time the University of Virginia, but turned it down. Also turned down a request to become the chaplain of the United States Congress. He too kept an extensive diary, and at his death had the second largest library in the United States after Thomas Jefferson. Bentley began his study of Arabic and other Oriental languages at Harvard, and his notebooks survive with those language exercises. Those notebooks also, and diaries, also record his correspondence with agents in the Middle East who helped him secure specific sources in Arabic and Persian, including manuscripts of the Qur'an. So statesmen, ministers, and scholars. Another category would be missionaries. I'm going to speak briefly about two, because American missionary activity in Muslim lands in the 1830s and 1840s was also an area in which increased American awareness of the Qur'an. The first man I'll mention is named James Lyman Merrick, and I could not find a photo of him, not even in the extensive photography archives at the library. For 10 years, he was a missionary in Persia on behalf of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. He became deeply involved in his missionary activity and in the people he was meeting, so that his desire to, in his words, become more intimately conversant with Mohammedanism, as he called it, developed apparently into such an appreciation of Islam that it troubled his superiors, and they recalled him to the United States. He came back, he ended up teaching as a professor of Oriental literature at Amherst College, but he too is a major figure in the exposure to the Qur'an among Americans of that century. The second of these figures is a man, Horatio Southgate, and here I do have a photo of him. He was ordained a priest in the Episcopal Church, and after 4 years as a missionary in Istanbul, he was consecrated as the missionary bishop for the Ottoman Empire. His exposure, however, to Islam did not have a positive impact. His experience left him far less sympathetic to those who, to quote him, are in bondage to false and pernicious faith of the Qur'an, and convinced him to charge the missionaries under his supervision to act as a kind of new crusade. Now, very briefly, to another category, that of American authors. And here I won't go into great detail, time is running out. But as some of you I think may know, Washington Irving, through his time in Spain, developed an interest in Islamic culture, and in fact wrote a biography of Muhammad known as Mahomet. I have trouble pronouncing that. Muhammad and his successors. Ralph Waldo Emerson features epigrams attributed to the Qur'an in some of his early essays. Edgar Allan Poe took the title of his second collection of verse from the 7th surah of the Qur'an. So just a sprinkling of ways in which famous American authors have used their exposure to the Qur'an. Now I'm going to return to that category of missionary and also to the West African context as I wrap this up. I'm going to talk about a man named Edward Wilmot Blyden. Blyden was born in the West Indies and was mentored by a Dutch Reformed minister and decided to attend seminary. He traveled to the United States to study at Rutgers Theological College, but was refused admission because of his race. And fearing apprehension as a runaway slave, he accepted an invitation from, again, the American Colonization Society to migrate to Liberia, to that colony established by the ACS there. Of course, in Liberia, Blyden encountered West African Islam, that same religious and cultural matrix that had formed Omar ibn Said and several others. He was intrigued by this encounter, and he went to Syria to learn Arabic and to begin studying the Qur'an. Here's an interesting reversal, a Christian moving from North America to West Africa, just as Omar ibn Said had moved in the other direction. Through his study, then, Blyden recognized the Qur'an's potential for the promotion of racial equality and transnational brotherhood, and its ability to unite Muslims across national and regional boundaries. In 1888, he published a widely influential volume entitled Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. It included a chapter on Mohammedanism in West Africa that details, to quote from this, the beneficial effects wrought by Islam upon the moral and industrial condition of West Africa. It notes in this book that for West African Muslims, the Qur'an, to quote, the Qur'an is almost always in their hands. It seems to be their labor and their relaxation to pore over its pages. Muslim solidarity became for Blyden the model for his emerging emphasis on the power of Pan-Africanism. During subsequent travel and speaking engagements in the United States, Blyden denounced Christianity as the religion of European colonizers and urged African Americans to embrace Islam as an African religion. His Qur'an-laced rhetoric forged an early ideological link with the black nationalism and Pan-Africanism of the 20th century, a powerful religio-political movement that gave us such figures as Marcus Garvey, Melville Drew Alley, Fard Muhammad, and Elijah Muhammad. And I'll conclude then with Melville Drew Alley, because his book, known as the Holy Qur'an, is also one of the parts of this 42 document collection, Omar Ibn Said collection. It too has been digitized and is part of what is online. Melville Drew Alley's origins are contested. He was born in either North Carolina or has been argued more recently in Virginia, but he eventually founded what is called the Moorish Science Temple. He preached that African Americans are not Negroes, rather their true nationality is Moorish Americans. And he urged Moorish Americans to return, and I'm quoting, that return the church and Christianity back to the European nations as it was prepared by their forefathers for their earthly salvation, while we, the Moorish Americans, are returning to Islam, which was founded by our forefathers for our earthly and divine salvation. The Moorish Science Temple promulgated its own Holy Qur'an, known as the Seven Circle Qur'an, from the seven in a circle on the title page of this. It's a text drawn from multiple sources, including what its adherents believe to be a lost part of the Qur'an. I'll conclude by bringing us back now for a moment to Omar Ibn Said. And as I do that, I'm going to put the URL for the digitized collection, the digitized manuscripts of this collection on the screen. You can also just Google it, Omar Ibn Said, Library of Congress, it will come up. But I wanted to give you that for your own records. So to come back now in closure to Omar Ibn Said. He died as I said, he died in 1864, just before the end of the Civil War, and the year after President Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. He died enslaved and apparently never married nor fathered any children. When you read his autobiography, and I urge you to do so, it's very brief, you hear the voice of a lonely man and one who cherishes memories of his homeland. Omar Ibn Said never returned to Senegal, but in 1998, Derek Beard, who had purchased that collection when it was first rediscovered, took the manuscript of Omar's autobiography to Senegal and shared it with scholars there. Now, in digitized form, it lives on a website with worldwide reach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for some Q&A for Professor McAuliffe. Questions? Spencer.
You know,
Good to see you.
you did mention that there was evidence of crypto practice of Islam, perhaps in some cases, such as in the case of Omar Ibn Said. Can you say anything more about that, or places where people might be able to research that further?
Of crypto practices of Islam?
Yes.
Yes, I think
for syncretic, yeah.
There is some evidence of this, although not very clearly documented. Some of it involves some figures whom I did not mention in this lecture because I had some sense of time constraints, and they are, again, slaves from West Africa who ended up on some of the sea islands off the coast of Georgia. Their descendants were interviewed in the 1930s as part of the Works Progress Administration, part of Roosevelt's New Deal, in which unemployed writers were put to work interviewing and writing up oral histories of people in various parts of the United States. And so the descendants of these slaves, whose families had continued to live on these offshore islands where there was less influence from other parts of the culture, recounted how their grandparents and great-grandparents had continued to do things such as praying and touching their foreheads to the ground, such as cooking certain things, such as giving alms, that they attributed and they recognized as being vestiges of their grandparents' Islamic practice. And there are other instances of that as well. Anybody have questions about the Library of Congress? I'm trying to get America's library here. Yes. Rich?
Yes, you and I discussed a little earlier, the self Jefferson Qur'an.
Yes.
And I was always see that. It's interesting that there wasn't a real interest in the religion and morals taught by Islam. In fact, many of the enlightened founding fathers were still Christians.
Mm-hmm.
But they, in their enlightened view of things, what they insisted on was that Jews and Muslims, or Muslims, had every right to hold their religion. Although your remarks would seem to sort of hint at that there was some influence of the religious ideas.
Well, no, I think in just the way you're describing, they both John Adams more, so Thomas Jefferson, and Professor Martin has referenced a very good book about Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an by a scholar named Denise Spellberg, who has, using a copy of the Library of Congress, has really researched this. And one of the things we can clearly identify is the influence of the exposure of someone like Jefferson to religions other than Christianity in their ability to imagine a society in which Muslims were citizens, although they didn't have any present or immediate future expectation of that. But the laws that he wrote and crafted for Virginia, and then within the American Constitution, at least theoretically, apply that notion of religious liberty and religious tolerance well beyond the realm of Christianity. And Spellberg's book, I think, makes a good case for that. There was someone, Terry, is that you back up?
A little bit farther back. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, fine.
I really was interested in perhaps you telling a little bit about what we can do through the Library of Congress about the slightly later period. I'm thinking of the time, for example, when the Cedar Rapids Mosque was founded in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. Does the library have any plans on sort of working with that material? Because I would imagine there's quite a bit.
I imagine it does. When we're dealing with a staff of about 3,500 at the Library of Congress, for me to keep up with all of the digitization work that's going on, I will say this, there is a huge new push to get materials digitized, materials that are unique to the Library of Congress. One of the things that we're all discovering at major university libraries and institutions like the Library of Congress is you can't digitize everything. It's an expensive process, but those things that are unique to the Library of Congress, we're working very hard to get digitized as quickly as possible. So if there are materials relevant to, as you say, the Cedar Rapids community in that early period, I'm sure they are on a queue for digitization. And I suspect, Terry, that you've also looked at what's available in the prints and photographs, digitized work in the prints and photographs division of the Library of Congress, because I keep finding all kinds of interesting things that are, again, being digitized by that particular division.
Well, it's very encouraging to hear. Because
Well, let me put in a plug, okay? I'm at the Library of Congress now, which has been a lot of fun, having spent all my life in the academic world, kind of stepped sideways into that of a scholarly, cultural institution. But, you realize that it's a great asset for people who are in Washington, D.C. I grew up as a little kid in D.C., and my father would take me down to the Library of Congress, and I did a thesis, went to college in Washington, and I did my senior project at the Library of Congress, but that's because I was living right there. Now, what the library wants to do is to make those resources much more accessible to people who are way beyond the geographic catchment area of the library. And the only way we can do that effectively is both to continue to digitize resources unique to the library. And if you go on, I would ask you all, in the next few days, just go on the library's website, just Google Library of Congress and see the kinds of stuff that comes up. Some of you may be interested in the fact that we have the world's biggest comic book collection, and the range of things is just phenomenal there. But we are working quickly to put those unique resources, make them ever more available for use by teachers, scholars, and everybody, so that they can genuinely feel that this is America's library. Yes?
To what extent would you say that these early instances of finding America had an impact on the propagation of Islam in America? So, like a lot of popular rhetoric and contemporary rhetoric is, attributes the growth of Islam in America to immigration and things like that. How would you link these instances to the growth of Islam in America? To the extent that you know, is it highly correlated or?
No, I don't think it's highly correlated in this very early period of the 18th and the early 19th century, because there would just not be the population and the immigration that you're referring to and that Professor DeYoung referred to earlier. Where it did, I think, was start to create an intellectual awareness that there was this scripture, that there was this religion, and especially when you get into those authors and to the surge of interest in things Oriental, generally, in the mid to late 19th century, I see that as kind of laying the groundwork for an understanding and appreciation that begins to build more generally in America. The 1893 the World Religion Congress in Chicago in 1893 was a kind of culmination of a lot of that, where religious figures from around the world convened and drew attention to this diversity and this religious pluralism. But demographically, it didn't really begin to express itself until the 20th century, and really express itself until after the change in the immigration laws in the 1960s. Yes?
I would expect that one of the aspects of the influence of the Qur'an in America would be through theological schools in the United States, where scholars might have acquired and learned about the Qur'an and Islam, and we taught that in classes to young Christian ministers or Jewish rabbis, depending on the particular institution. Do you have any information or knowledge of that propagation of knowledge of the Quran and Islam through the scholarship to willing, receptive audiences of students?
I do. You could almost be a plant. I'm going to say two things about this. My first teaching position as a newly minted PhD in Islamic Studies was at the Cantor School of Theology in Atlanta, Georgia, part of Emory University. I was hired as apparently the first Islamicist in the state of Georgia, and I was hired specifically to help teach students who were preparing for Christian ministry something about Islam and the Qur'an, and at that point, other religious traditions as well. Because this was in the mid-1980s, there was a recognition that in major metropolitan centers like Atlanta and its surroundings, those new ministers were going to meet very multicultural congregations, or at least neighborhoods in which their own congregations were situated. So yes, now that has moved on apace in schools of theology since then. It was a rather unusual move at the time that I was hired, as I say, in the mid-1980s. But then go back a few generations, it really wasn't Christian theologians who were interested in at least exposing their students to Islam, but it was biblical scholars. It was biblical studies, both in the 19th and the 20th century, where as they were training the next generation of scholars of the Bible, they wanted them to know about the linguistic environment in which the Bible itself had developed, and that led them to insist that their students study cognate languages, including Arabic. And a whole slew of those kinds of younger scholars, especially in the mid-19th century, then kind of migrated from biblical studies into Islamic studies and started some of the very first highly philological work in the Western Academy in Islamic studies.
Any particular individuals?
Oh, the whole history, I mean, the one we go back to is Theodor Nodlicka as one of the fathers, Abraham Geiger even earlier than that, and virtually any of the German scholars in the mid-19th century began with biblical studies and biblical philology and then moved into Arabic. Yes? I wish they were using more. One of the things that surprised me, as I've just said, I grew up in D.C. and I knew the Library of Congress from the time I was a little child, but in my mind, the emphasis was always on library, and then Congress was just this kind of thing over here, tacked on to the title. Once I got inside and began working there, I realized it's the Library of Congress, very much so. The Congress uses it a lot, and one of the ways in which they do this is through a dedicated research division known as the Congressional Research Service. We have about 600 or 700 people in the Library of Congress who do nothing but answer queries from congressional offices. And they write briefings and reports, and they use every resource within the library in the service of Congress. The other way we know in which we are the Library of Congress is that all of our money comes from Congress. The Library of Congress is part of the legislative branch, not the executive branch. And so we're very closely affiliated with the U.S. Congress. I would urge you, if you get to Washington, go to the building, the Thomas Jefferson Building. It is unarguably the most beautiful public building in Washington. And one of the rooms in there, you wouldn't believe it. I mean, you wouldn't believe it was built on taxpayer dollars, but it was back in 1897, is this huge room that was just for the use of members of Congress. And there is, now it's used more broadly than that for events, but there's a smaller congressional reading room, and it's a place where members of Congress, frankly, go and hide away sometimes and just, get caught up on things or get their heads in shape. Oh, is this it? Okay.
Yes, that's all the time we have. Please join me again in thanking Professor Jane McAuliffe.